Everyone, today we'll be covering the concepts of ratio and proportion, and we'll just be learning the concepts, the important formulae that are involved, and then we'll be moving on to partnerships, the concept of partnerships, and then the concepts and questions involved in that. So, let's begin. So, what exactly do we mean by ratio and proportion? So, first we'll be covering ratio. Okay, so both of these concepts are based on fractions, and this needs to be extremely clear, the concepts regarding this, if you want to move on to ratio and proportion. Okay, so a ratio is essentially depicted as P is to Q. So, what P is to Q means is that it's P upon Q, where this is a fraction. Okay, so in daily life, when somebody says that the ratio of flour and sugar needs to be 3:5, what that means is that you need to use 3 parts flour and 5 parts sugar. So in daily life, you will often encounter situations where you'll actually have to put this concept to use. If you want to say that the proportion of the bedroom and the living hall has to be, the ratio of the volume of the bedroom and the living hall has to be 3:5. What that means is that the bedroom, if it's 3x, then your living room has to be 5x. So you will often encounter situations like this in real life. Okay, so what do you mean by P and Q? P and Q, this is called antecedent, which corresponds to the numerator. This is the numerator here, and this is the consequent, which is actually the denominator. Right. So once these concepts are clear, we also now need to know that P and Q have to be integers. They cannot be decimals, because you will never see a fraction like 2.5 upon 5.83. This is simply wrong. This is not how you depict fractions. The way to do it is 2 upon 5. This is how you depict fractions. So what exactly are integers? So if this is your number line, this is 0, then you have your regular numbers, which is 1, 2, 3, and so on, 4, and so on, and then you move on to the negatives, which is -1, -2, -3, and so on. Similar to fractions, your ratio can be -3:5. Your -3:5 would actually be correspondent to 3:5. So these are rules that you also use in fractions. So you just apply them to ratios as well. Okay, so let's first see certain rules that are used when you are using ratios or just using the concept of ratios. So let's look at rules. The rules are, the ratio should actually be, so P and Q should be quantities of the same kind. You cannot compare 3 liters of water and 3 seconds of time. It does not make sense to compare 3 liters of water and 3 seconds of time. How will you compare this? It does not make sense at all. So another rule is that the units should be the same. So your ratio is dimensionless. So you need to remember that ratio is usually dimensionless. So your units should actually be the same. So it can be 3 kilometers upon 5 kilometers. So this gets cancelled and your ratio is 3 is to 5. If it's 3 meters upon 3 kilometers, it actually needs to be converted where now it's 3 meters and 3 into 1000 meters. So your ratio is now 1 is to 1000, which is also dimensionless. So also one general rule is that if your numbers are like differing a lot, so if it's not a significant amount of terms, so for example you have 3 is to infinity, this will actually be 0. So that's because imagine it's 3 and you're dividing it by a number that's extremely large. It would almost be 0.0000 many decimals, and then you get a 3. So that is essentially equal to 0, and hence they need to be of significant order of terms. So like they need to be 3 is to 5 or something similar, like 3 is to 50, 3 is to 1000, but it cannot be 3 is to infinity. Now to keep a ratio constant, so if your ratio is, let's choose other numbers, if your ratio is say 5 is to 8, now this ratio, if you want to keep it constant but you are also planning to multiply it, then you have to multiply your antecedent as well as your consequent, and both of them have to be multiplied by the same number. So if I'm multiplying 5 by 5, 8 also has to be multiplied by 5. Only then it would be the same ratio. So that in this case would be 25 is to 40, and that is our ratio, which is equivalent to 5 is to 8. Now there are certain terms that are associated with ratios. So if you have the ratio which is p is to q, then p square is to q square is actually, I'm just going to use this symbol here, is called the duplicate ratio. Your root p is to root q is actually called the subduplicate ratio, and your p cube is to q cube is a triplicate ratio. However, these aren't very important terminologies because I don't think they will actually ask questions which involve the words duplicate and triplicate, but again you can just remember these. So if you want to compare two ratios, what do? So if you have p is to q and you have say x is to y, and you want to compare these, which one is greater than the other? So you can write p upon q and x upon y. So if say p upon q is greater than x upon y, then you can cross multiply and you will have to realize that p into y is actually greater than q into x. What you need to know is that if p upon q is equal to x upon y, then py is equal to qx. Similarly, if it is equal, then it also implies that p upon x is equal to q upon y. You can also inverse it, so you have q upon p is equal to x upon p is equal to y upon q. Adding a whole number on both sides would mean that you are actually, so if p upon q and you add a number say 1, and that would actually be equal to x upon y, and you are adding 1 here. So this would actually be equal to p plus q upon q, and that would be equal to x plus y upon y, and this could be written as p plus q is to q, which is equal to x plus y is to y. Similarly, if you can replace 1 with minus 1, and you will obtain the same results. Upon doing certain manipulations, you will realize that p plus q upon p minus q is actually equal to x plus y upon x minus y. And only in this condition, all of these are valid. So this can be written as p plus q is to p minus q is equivalent to x plus y upon is to x minus y. So I think now we can summarize that a ratio is essentially an expression which is used to compare the size of, like, compare the quantity of two things which are of the same kind. And yeah, so we can now move on to the questions. Also, I forgot to mention that if you multiply, then it's the same, but also if you divide it, if you divide, say you have 6 is to 9, you divide this by 3, then to keep the ratio equivalent, you will have to divide the consequent by 3 as well, and that would be 2 is to 3, which is the same as 6 is to 9. Also, one last concept, that the compounded ratio of certain ratios, so if you have a is to b, you have c is to d, and you have e is to f, then the compounded ratios would actually be a c e is to b d f, where all of these terms are multiplied to each other. So let's look at our first question. It says that in a mixture of 60 liters, the ratio of milk and water is 2 is to 1. So let's just write milk is to water is 2 is to 1. If this ratio is to be 1 is to 2, then the quantity of water to be further added is. So what this question is saying is that your quantity of milk would be the same, only your quantity of water is changing. So by how much does it change? So let's first look at what all of this says. So milk, so in 2x parts milk, you have x parts water. So this is milk, this is has x parts water. So your total quantity, like, combined, so if you have 2x liters of milk, it has x liters of water. So if you just add these two quantities, you will actually realize that 2x plus x liters comes out to be 60 liters, which is the mixture. Now this is actually equal to 3x and this is equal to 60, so your x will be equal to 60 upon 3, which is equal to 20 liters. Now this means your x is 20 liters, so your milk quantity is 20 into 2, which is 40 liters, and your water is 20 liters. You can verify the ratio that milk is to water is equal to 40 is to 20, and like we learned before, we need to divide both the numbers by the same number in order to keep the ratio the same. So we divide both of these numbers by 20 and we get 2 is to 1. So that is verified. Now we are adding water such that your ratio will turn to 1 is to 2. This is milk to water. So we know that milk is 40 liters is to y liters water is equal to 1 is to 2. So the way we can write this is 40 upon y is equal to 1 upon 2. So this means 80, like we need to cross multiply, 80 is equal to y. So your y is now 80 liters water. Now because this is 80 liters water and our initial quantity of water was actually 20 liters, initial quantity of water is 20 liters, we can now deduce that the amount of water to be added is 80 minus 20, which is equal to 60 liters, and that is your final answer. Your next question is, two numbers are respectively 20% and 50% more than a third number. So what is the ratio of the two numbers? So let's say the two numbers are a and b and the third number is x. So a is 100 plus 20% of x. This is because it is 20% more, and b is actually 100 plus 50% of x. So this means that 120 a is actually 120 upon 100 x, and your b is 150 upon 100 y. So we now what we do is 120, so your a is to b will be equal to a upon b, which is 120 upon 150 in this case. You cut these two numbers, 3 4s are 3 5s are. You always divide by highest common factor, such that the least common multiple of a and b, so this is a general rule, a and b should be a into b. Okay, so this is 4:5, and that is our final answer. Okay, so yeah, moving on to proportion, we can see that if we have two ratios, which is a is to b and c is to d, then if these two ratios are equal to each other, then they are said to be in proportion. So essentially the way it is expressed is a is to b is equal to c is to d, and that means it is a is to b is equal to c is to d. So here these are the means, and a and d are the extremes. So when you say something is directly proportional, it means that if two quantities x and y directly proportional to each other, which means that if x increases, y also increases. If they are inversely proportional to each other, you can conclude that if x increases, y decreases. Let us discuss some properties. So while explaining ratio, I actually discussed several properties, which are componendo dividendo property, convertendo property, dividendo property, and also componendo property. But there are certain properties that I have not discussed, and it is solely related to proportions. So addendo property. So if you have ratios a is to b is equal to c is to d, and that is equal to e is to f, then the value of each ratio is actually a plus c plus e is to b plus d plus f. Similarly, subtrahendo property means that Similarly, if you have a is to b is equal to c is to d is equal to e is to f, let's just consider these two, then you know that a minus c is to b minus d is actually equal to a is to b, which is equal to c is to d. Now let us discuss the concept of continued proportion. Continued proportion. So in this, if you have two ratios which are again a is to b and c is to d, and they are reduced such that the LCM of both of them, so if you want to make a continued proportion out of these, so we are going to now say that, so we know that the LCM of b and c is actually bc, because we know that all of these fractions have been reduced to the lowest form. So b and c's LCM is bc. So we actually now multiply a by c and b by c, and we multiply b to c, we also multiply b to d. So this becomes, and they're equal fractions, because if you multiply the same number in the numerator, if you multiply the antecedent and consequent with the same number, then it is the same proportion. So your AC is to BC will be the same as A is to B, and your BC is to BD will be the same as C is to D. And the continued proportion for this case will now be AC is to BC is to BD. Certain terminologies again, if you have A is to B equal to C is to D, then D is called the fourth proportional to A, B and C. C is called the third proportion to A and B, and the mean proportional between A and B would actually be root AB. So let's move on to the question now. A sum of money is to be distributed among A, B, C and D in the proportion of 5 is to 2 is to 4 is to 3. Now if C gets 1000 rupees more than D, what is B's share? So these proportions can actually be written as 5x. So A gets 5x, B gets 2x, C gets 4x and D gets 3x. This is the amount of money that everybody gets. Now you know that C gets rupees 1000 more than D. So C gets rupees 1000 more than D. So the difference between C and D's money will be 1000 rupees. So your X is now 1000. What is B's share? So we know that B's share is 2x. B's share is 2x, and that is equal to 2 into 1000, which we know as rupees 2000. Hence this is the amount of money that B gets. One thing I forgot to mention in multiplication of ratios by a common number is that number can never be 0. I'm just going to write that down. This number can never be 0. That is because your denominator cannot be 0 according to basic rules of math. Okay, so let's just move on to the next question here. So this is a bit of a quirky question where you have a decimal here instead of an integer. So 0.75 is to x is directly proportional to 5 is to 8. Then what is x? So we know that 0.75 upon x is equal to, so this symbol just means equal to, this just means equal to, is equal to 5 upon 8. Then what is x? So we cross multiply here. So 0.75 into 8 is equal to 5x. We divide this by 5 and this gets cancelled then. This is 5 ones are 5, 0.15. So your x is equal to 0.15 into 8, which is 6 by 5, which is equal to 1.2. So your x is equal to 1.2. So now let's move on to partnership questions. Now the basic concept that you need to remember is that in partnership questions, your profit is sort of directly proportional to the amount you invested. So let's just directly jump into the questions so we get the hang of this better. A, B and C subscribe rupees 50,000 for a business. So they put in 50,000 rupees into a business. A subscribes rupees 4,000 more than B and B rupees 5,000 more than C. So your total profit is rupees 35,000. So how much of that profit does A receive? So what we need to first do is find out the total amount of money that A, B and C gave individually, and then you find the ratio of that and then you multiply it by 35,000. Okay, so easy enough. Let's begin. So we know that. So let the amount invested, I'm just going to draw a line. Just going to draw a line here. This is not a good line. I'm just going to change the color. So amount invested by C, let it be X. Amount invested by B, let it be, so we know that B invests rupees 5,000 more than C, so that will be X plus 5,000. And amount invested by A is 4,000 more than B, so by A is X plus 5,000 plus 4,000 because it's more than B, so that is X plus 9,000. So if we add all of these numbers, we'll get A plus B plus C, which is 3x plus 5,000 plus 9,000, which is equal to your total amount, which is 50,000 rupees. So that is 50,000 rupees. So 3x plus 14,000 is 50,000 rupees. So your 3x is actually 50,000 minus 14,000, which is 36,000. You will get x to be 36,000 divided by 3, which is 12,000 rupees. Now you know that it is 12,000 rupees. So now you can find the amount invested by A, which is 12,000 plus 9,000, which is equal to 21,000. Amount invested by B would be 12,000 plus 5,000, which is equal to 17,000. And amount invested by C is 12,000. So the proportion of this will actually be A is to B is to C, which is 21 is to 17 is to 12. I am neglecting the 3 zeros because they cancel out, because if we divide every number by 1000, it is not going to make a difference. So we also know that the sum of all of this, so we know that 21 plus 17 plus 12 is equal to 50, which is the total sort of pool, out of which 21 was given by A, 17 was given by B and 12 was given by C. So A's share would now be rupees 35,000 into 21 divided by 50, because that much money A had invested, which is equal to, zeros cancel out, 5 sevens are 700, so that is rupees 14700. So that is a basic partnership question. Yeah, you can solve more and get more practice, but usually this is how they're solved. So that is the end of today's video. Thank you so much for watching.